The first thing I noticed that morning was the smell of burnt coffee and overconfidence. Someone in the break room had left the Keurig running on empty again. That scorched plastic smell drifting all the way down to the server room where I was crouched under the main rack, manually rebooting a fiber switch that had been dropping packets since 3 in the morning. I'd gotten the alert on my phone at 2:47 a.m. I was in the office by 3:15, not because anyone asked me to be, because that's what you do when you've spent 17 years being the person who keeps the lights on. My name is Daniel Walsh. Dan to anyone who's worked alongside me long enough to earn it. I'm 52 years old. I've been the head of IT infrastructure at this logistics software company since 2007, back when the whole operation fit inside a converted warehouse space that smelled like motor oil and ambition, when we had 3 full-time employees, 1 whiteboard, and a founder who thought server was something that brought you drinks at a restaurant. By the time that Tuesday rolled around, we had 182 employees, a glass-paneled headquarters, standing desks that cost more than my first car, and a new CTO who'd been on the job for 8 months and already had a favorite word: modernize. I knew what that word meant. I'd heard it before. Not in this building, but I recognized the shape of it. Modernize. Like the infrastructure I'd built over 17 years was some rusted-out bridge that needed tearing down instead of the backbone that was currently, right at that moment, keeping their entire order management platform alive. The fiber switch came back online at 6:41 a.m. I documented the fix in the ticketing system, logged the incident, sent a summary to the systems team. Then I refilled my thermos and sat down at my desk and opened the task I'd been putting off because I wanted to make sure everything else was stable first. The annual renewal for our enterprise software license. The vendor was called Cornerstone Systems. They made the order management platform that processed every single transaction the company touched: inbound freight, outbound logistics, customer billing, carrier integrations. The whole operation ran on it. When we'd signed on back in 2007, Cornerstone had been cautious about signing a startup with no credit history and a business account that had $400 in it. Our founder, a man named Roger Kelso, had gotten turned down twice for the enterprise agreement. Then, he'd come to me. He'd sat across from me at a booth in a Greek diner, around the corner from the warehouse, and slid a manila folder across the table. The MSA, he'd said. Master Service Agreement. They'll approve it if there's a personal guarantor with good credit. My credit was fine. I was 35, no debt, owned a small house, paid my bills. He promised he'd get the agreement transferred to the company once we were established. Once the balance sheet looked like something a vendor would trust. We both forgot about it. Or rather, Roger sold the company in 2019 to a private equity firm and moved to Colorado to open a fly fishing guide business. And by then, 17 renewal cycles had passed, and my name was still the one at the top of every contract. The company had grown around that agreement the way a tree grows around a fence post. Nobody questioned it. Nobody thought to check. The renewal emails came to my work address. I processed them every year in September, same as I'd done since the first one. It was just part of the job. It had always been just part of the job. I had the renewal tab open on my screen at 8:47 a.m. when the calendar invite landed. Subject: Quick Touch Base HR. No description, no context. Organizer: Melissa Horn, Director of People Operations. That was what they called HR now. People Operations. Like we were a fleet of machines being optimized for output. The invite was for 9 o'clock. 13 minutes away. I closed the renewal tab. I told myself I'd come back to it after the meeting. I picked up my thermos and I went. The conference room was called Innovation Hub, because, of course it was. Melissa was already seated when I walked in. Next to her was a man I recognized from the org chart but had never spoken to directly, the company's outside employment counsel, a tall guy named Brett who wore cufflinks on a Tuesday and kept his hands very still in the way people do when they've delivered bad news so many times it no longer requires physical expression. There was also a box of tissues on the table. That's always a tell. Melissa smiled the way people smile at dental appointments. Dan, thanks so much for making time. I said I'd been in the building since 3 in the morning, so time wasn't really the issue. She didn't laugh. We're going through a significant transformation, she said, restructuring the technical leadership layer to align with our new strategic vision. I looked at Brett. He looked at his still hands. I've been through enough corporate restructurings to know that transformation and vision are 2 words that mean someone else decided your seat at the table wasn't worth the wood it was built from. I asked if I was being let go. Melissa said they were eliminating my role. I asked what the difference was. Brett answered that one. There wasn't much of one. The package was 3 months, Cobra through the end of the year, a non-disparagement clause so aggressively worded it practically came with a muzzle. The letter called me Daniel R. Walsh, which was almost right. My middle initial is B. It's been B for 52 years. Melissa asked me to return my badge, my company laptop, any physical keys or access cards, and any documentation, proprietary materials, or company property in my possession. They'd arranged for my personal items to be boxed and sent to my house. I set the badge on the table. I set the laptop bag next to it. I had a single key, a physical server room key they'd issued me in 2009 that nobody had ever asked me to give back. I set that down too, and then I paused. Because there was something else in my bag, not company property. My property, a yellow legal pad, 3 pages of handwritten notes I'd been keeping about the Cornerstone renewal, the account holder's login, the auto-renewal toggle I'd disabled in 2021 because the system had accidentally double-billed us and I'd switched to manual processing to maintain control, the payment method on file, my personal Visa card. Because when I'd first set up the account in 2007, the company had no corporate card to put on file. I'd put my own card down and expensed it every year. Except last year, when the expense reimbursement system had changed platforms, and somehow my submission had gotten lost in the migration, and I'd never followed up because I'd been too busy keeping everything running to chase down $300. I looked at Melissa. I looked at Brett. I looked at the box of tissues nobody had touched. I put my bag over my shoulder. Is there anything else you need from me? I asked. Melissa said they'd follow up by email with next steps. Brett said to make sure I'd read the non-disparagement clause carefully. I said I'd read it. I walked out of Innovation Hub and down the hall and through the lobby and out into the September air, and the sun hit my face like an open palm, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed. Then I drove to the diner where Roger and I had signed the original Cornerstone agreement 15 years ago. It was still there, still had the same laminated menus. I ordered black coffee and scrambled eggs, and I sat in the same booth and I opened my laptop. My work email was already deactivated. I'd expected that. What I hadn't expected was how quiet my inbox looked on my personal account. No alerts, no tickets, no 3 a.m., server notifications. Just the Cornerstone renewal email I'd been CC'd on as account holder 3 weeks ago. Pending action. Due today. I called my college roommate, a man I'd known for 30 years who now practiced technology and IP law in a firm downtown. I'd helped him set up his home network 4 years ago in exchange for a case of single malt scotch and his word that he owed me one. I told him what happened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked me whose name was on the Cornerstone MSA. Mine, I said. He asked if there had ever been a formal assignment of the agreement to the company. I told him there hadn't. He asked if the payment on file was my personal card. I told him it was. He was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, the kind that precedes a low whistle, which is exactly what came next. He said, Dan, you understand that as the contracting party of record, you're under no legal obligation to renew that agreement on behalf of a company that just terminated your employment. I said, I understand that. He said, and you understand that if the agreement isn't renewed today, it enters a 60-day grace period before termination, during which the company would be notified and given the opportunity to establish their own account directly with Cornerstone. I said, so they'd have 60 days to fix it themselves. He said, they'd have 60 days to fix it. If they reach out to you directly to facilitate a transfer, that's a conversation you're entitled to have on your own terms. I told him I appreciated the clarity. He said, what are you going to do? I closed the renewal screen. I closed the laptop. I looked out the window at the street where Roger and I had parked our used cars on a winter morning in 2007. 2 guys with a big idea and not enough credit to support it. I said, I'm going to eat my eggs. I didn't call Cornerstone. I didn't transfer the account. I didn't cancel it, because that would have been something I did. Instead, I did nothing. The renewal deadline passed. The account moved to grace period status. An automated email went to my personal address, informing me the payment method had not been updated and the renewal was pending. I read it at my kitchen table and set my phone face down next to my father's old IBM programming manual, the one he'd given me when I was 14 and had just gotten my first computer. The cover was held on with electrical tape. He'd always said, if you understand how the foundation works, you'll never be helpless. That book had sat on my desk at every job I'd ever had. They'd sent back my other personal items in a box, but they hadn't sent that. because I'd taken it home myself the night before, when I'd had a feeling. The first week was almost peaceful. I slept past 6 for the first time in years. I cooked actual meals. I went for runs in the morning without checking my phone every quarter mile. I called my brother in Phoenix. I fixed the fence gate I'd been ignoring since spring. On the 11th day, my former colleague texted me. He was the senior network engineer I'd hired in 2015, a methodical, calm man who'd worked alongside me for 8 years and was the closest thing to a protege I'd ever had. He just sent 4 words, "Platform is acting weird." I didn't respond. I wasn't on the payroll. I wasn't the account holder of record for the company. I was a private citizen eating breakfast. On the 14th day, he called. His voice was controlled but tight in the way voices get when someone is trying to project calm in the middle of a problem they don't fully understand yet. He said the Cornerstone platform was throwing authentication errors, intermittent at first, now constant. The integration with their carrier management system had dropped. Order processing was falling through. Nobody could figure out why, because nobody could log into the admin backend. I asked why they couldn't log in. He said because the master admin credentials were tied to an email address nobody could access. I asked which email address. My personal one. The one they deactivated when they ended my employment. I told him I understood. I told him I was sorry he was in the middle of it. I told him he should escalate it to the new CTO. On day 16, the new CTO called me directly. I didn't know he had my personal number, but I supposed HR had given it to him in whatever panic had overtaken the executive floor. His name was Marcus. He was 38, Northwestern MBA, had spent 5 years at a consulting firm before being brought in to modernize the technical stack. He'd sat in one meeting with me in February and spent most of it looking at his phone. He said, "Dan, we've got a major situation with the Cornerstone system." I said, "I heard." He said, "We need access to the master account. The renewal is past due, and we can't get in to update the payment method because the credentials are linked to your work email." I said, "Right." He said, Can you log in and reset the credentials? It would take 5 minutes." I said, "Marcus, I don't have a work email anymore. You deactivated it on day 1. He said, "I know, but there must be a way to recover access. Can you call Cornerstone?" I said, "I could, but I'm not currently employed by your company." There was a silence on the other end that lasted long enough for me to pour a second cup of coffee. He said, "What are you saying?" I said, "I'm saying that the Cornerstone MSA is a contract between Cornerstone Systems and me, personally, not between Cornerstone and the company. I became aware of this situation after my employment was terminated, and I've been looking into what my obligations are. The short answer is that I have none, unless we reach some kind of arrangement." Another silence. This one had a different texture. Less confusion, more calculation. He said, "Are you asking for money?" I said, "I'm asking to be treated like an adult who spent 17 years building your infrastructure and got a misspelled termination letter for it. I'm asking for a conversation, a real one. Not with HR, with whoever's actually in charge of decisions." He said he'd call me back. He called back in 45 minutes. On the line with him was the CEO, a woman named Patricia, who had joined the company 2 years after I had, and whom I respected enough to level with. She'd always known my name, spelled correctly, even. She said, "Dan, help me understand what we're dealing with here." I walked her through it. The 2007 agreement, Roger's credit problem, the MSA in my name, the 17 years of uninterrupted renewals, the payment card, the master admin credentials tied to an email address the company had revoked. I told her none of this was malicious on my part. I hadn't hidden it. I hadn't weaponized it. I had simply been fired before I could process the annual renewal that had been on my task list for that very morning. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you need?" I said, "First, I need you to understand that I don't want to hurt the company. There are 180 people working there who had nothing to do with how I was let go. But I also spent 17 years as the invisible foundation of that place, and I walked out with a 3-month package and a letter with the wrong middle initial. So I'd like my severance extended. I'd like the non-disparagement clause removed from both sides. I'd like a proper letter of reference, not the generic HR template, an actual letter, signed by you. And I'd like a consulting agreement, fair market rate, 60 days, to supervise the transfer of the Cornerstone account to the company's own credentials and document every other system and process that currently runs through my personal accounts or contacts." She said, "There are others?" I said, "Patricia, I set up the company's first domain registration in 2007 on my personal GoDaddy account because we couldn't get a business account approved in time for our website launch. I've renewed it every year. The SSL certificate for your main customer portal runs through a reseller relationship I have personally. The monitoring platform for your server room sends alerts to my cell phone because I set it up before the company had a formal operations inbox. I'm not threatening to pull any of it. I'm telling you that when you fired me, you fired the person who knew where all of these threads were, and now you're holding a sweater that's starting to unravel, and you need someone to help you secure the edges before it goes further. A long pause. She said, "Give me an hour." She called back in 50 minutes. She agreed to everything. I signed the revised consulting agreement at my kitchen table with my father's programming manual sitting next to the paperwork like a witness. The engagement started the following Monday. What I walked into that Monday was instructive, not because anything had exploded beyond what I already knew about, but because of what I saw on the faces of people who had worked alongside me for a decade. The senior network engineer met me at the lobby door and shook my hand without saying anything, which was its own kind of statement. The woman who ran the help desk, who had been on my team for 9 years, hugged me in the hallway. The server room smelled exactly the same. Coffee and cool air and that faint electrical hum that I'd been hearing for so long it had become my version of silence. I worked methodically. I documented everything. I transferred the Cornerstone master account to a new email address under the company's domain. I updated the payment method. I transferred the domain registration and the SSL certificate. I rebuilt the monitoring alert routing so that it ran through the operations team inbox instead of my phone. I wrote documentation so thorough that a competent person could maintain it without ever having met me. I did the work right because that was who I was, regardless of who was watching. On the last day of the consulting engagement, Marcus stopped by the server room. He stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets and looked at the rack I'd built out in 2018 and the cable management I'd done by hand on a Saturday because I didn't want to wait for a contractor. He said, "I didn't know any of this was in your name." I said, "I know." He said, "Why didn't you say something?" I said, "I mentioned it in my annual review in 2019. I mentioned it in the system audit I filed in 2021. I sent an email to the previous CTO in 2022 suggesting we formalize all of the infrastructure ownership agreements before they became a liability. I have the receipts if you'd like to see them." He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "For what it's worth, the decision to eliminate your role wasn't mine." I said, "I know that too." I finished my coffee, closed my laptop, and packed up my bag. I stopped at the front desk on the way out and said goodbye to the woman there, who had been answering phones at this company since 2011, and who always kept a small dish of peppermints on the corner of her desk that she'd been filling for as long as I could remember. She pressed one into my hand when I shook hers and told me to take care of myself. I drove home the long way, past the diner where Roger and I had worked out the terms of my employment on a cocktail napkin over turkey clubs in 2007. It had new signage now, but the same parking lot. I sat at a light for a moment and thought about that version of me, 35 years old, sharp and eager, absolutely certain that if you built something solid for someone, they'd remember it. I wasn't wrong about the building part. I was wrong about the remembering. My brother called from Phoenix that evening. He asked how the last day went. I told him it went fine. He asked what I was going to do next. I walked out to my garage and looked at the shelf, where I keep the things that matter. My father's IBM manual, the photo of my parents at their kitchen table in 1987, a framed printout of the first piece of software I ever wrote, at age 16, that actually did what it was supposed to do. I hung something new up there that evening. The original Cornerstone contract from 2007, my copy, coffee-stained, stapled twice. I didn't frame it. I just put it on the shelf where I could see it, next to my father's book. By October, I had 3 clients. By December, I had 6. I set my own hours. I charged what I was worth, which turned out to be considerably more than what I'd been paid for 17 years of being the invisible thing that kept everything running. Every contract I signed, I read twice. Every agreement I entered, I made sure was documented in both parties' names, properly, from day one. My former colleague resigned 2 months after I did, called me on a Wednesday afternoon and said he couldn't stomach working for people who calculated the value of institutional knowledge the same way they calculated the depreciation on office furniture. I told him I understood. I asked what he was going to do. He said he wasn't sure yet. I told him I had more work than I could handle alone, and that I knew for a fact he was the best network engineer I'd ever worked with, and that if he wanted to build something, I had a foundation we could start from. He said yes, without hesitating. I thought about my father when he'd handed me that IBM manual at the kitchen table, 38 years ago, and said, "Daniel, computers are just systems. And systems, at the end of the day, are just agreements between parts about how to behave. Your job is to understand the agreements well enough that when one part tries to walk away from the deal, you know exactly what that means." I'd spent 17 years honoring every agreement I was part of, including the ones nobody bothered to put in writing. I honored them with early mornings and late nights and weekends nobody asked me to work, and 3 a.m. reboots I never put on my timesheet because that wasn't the kind of person I was. I did the work right, not because anyone was watching, but because that's who my father raised me to be. What I took from that building when I walked out wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. The kind that only comes after you've spent long enough in a room where you were so fundamental to the walls and the floors and the ceiling that nobody saw you until the temperature started dropping. I was the infrastructure. And when you fire the infrastructure, you don't get to be surprised when the system fails to run itself. They thought they were eliminating a cost center. They were severing a root system they'd never bothered to map. Some people learn that lesson from a business school case study. Some people learn it when the platform that processes every order in their company goes dark at 2 p.m. on a Thursday, and nobody in the building knows the master account credentials, or who to call, or where the documentation lives, because the documentation was in one man's head and on one man's hard drive and tied to one man's name. And that man is at home at that moment eating scrambled eggs in a diner booth, reading his father's programming book, and not answering work emails. Because he doesn't have a work email anymore. They told me I was redundant. What they meant was that they'd forgotten I was foundational. Foundations don't get redundant. They just stop holding up the people who forgot to say thank you. And it turns out there are a lot of people out there who still know how to say it.